The morning mist hung low over Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at the grand window of her private chambers. Her fingers traced the cold glass while she watched the groundskeepers tending to the perfectly manicured gardens below. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on her shoulders, and the once familiar surroundings now felt suffocating rather than comforting. Prince William had left early for his royal duties, as had become his pattern in recent weeks. Their conversations had grown shorter, more formal, lacking the warmth and intimacy that once defined their relationship. The distance between them seemed to widen with each passing day, though neither had addressed it directly. Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Sarah, entered quietly with the morning tea service. She had been with the princess for nearly 8 years and could read her moods with remarkable accuracy. Today, she sensed something different, a finality that hadn't been there before. "Your Royal Highness," Sarah said softly, setting the delicate china on the mahogany table. "The children's tutors are asking about this afternoon's schedule." Catherine turned from the window, her expression distant. "Tell them the children will be staying at Anmer Hall for an extended period. I'll be joining them shortly." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. "Shall I inform His Royal Highness of the change in plans?" "No," Catherine replied, her voice carrying an edge that surprised even herself. "He'll learn about it when the time is right." The decision had been forming in Catherine's mind for weeks, perhaps months. The constant scrutiny, the unspoken tensions within the royal family, and, most troubling of all, the growing influence of Queen Camilla had created an atmosphere she could no longer tolerate. What had begun as small disagreements about protocol and public engagements had evolved into something far more serious. The breaking point had come 3 days earlier during a private family dinner at Clarence's house. King Charles had been discussing future plans for the monarchy, outlining changes he wanted to implement. Camilla had been unusually vocal, offering suggestions that seemed designed to diminish Catherine's role while elevating her own position and influence. "We must consider what's best for the crown," Camilla had said, her voice carrying that particular tone Catherine had learned to recognize, sweet on the surface but calculating underneath. "Perhaps it's time for some of our younger family members to step back and focus on their personal lives rather than their public duties." The suggestion had been veiled but unmistakably directed at Catherine. William had remained silent, a fact that hurt more than any direct confrontation might have. Later that evening, when Catherine had tried to discuss the incident with her husband, he had dismissed her concerns as oversensitivity. "Camilla is trying to help," he had said, not meeting her eyes. "She understands the pressures of this life better than most." That response had shattered something fundamental in Catherine. The man she had married, the one who had once promised to protect her from the very forces now threatening to overwhelm her, seemed either unwilling or unable to see what was happening. Now, as she prepared to make one of the most difficult decisions of her life, Catherine felt a strange sense of calm. She had spent sleepless nights considering every angle, every consequence. The media storm that would follow would be unprecedented. The impact on her children would be significant. The damage to the monarchy's reputation could be severe. But staying had begun to feel like a betrayal of herself and everything she had once believed about love, partnership, and mutual respect. Sarah returned with Catherine's private secretary, Marcus, a distinguished man in his 50s who had served the royal household with unwavering discretion for over 2 decades. His face was carefully neutral, but Catherine could see the concern in his eyes. "Ma'am," Marcus said with a slight bow, "I've received several requests from the press office about your upcoming engagements. They're particularly interested in your appearance at next week's charity gala with Her Majesty the Queen." Catherine moved to her writing desk, a beautiful antique that had belonged to Queen Victoria. She sat down and reached for her personal stationery, her movements deliberate and measured. "Please cancel all my engagements for the next month," she said without looking up. "Send my regrets to the appropriate parties." Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Sarah. "Ma'am, if I may ask, is there a particular reason for this change? Should we cite health concerns or family matters?" "You may cite personal reasons," Catherine replied, beginning to write. "That will be sufficient." As she penned what would become one of the most scrutinized letters in recent royal history, Catherine thought about the early days of her marriage to William. The fairy tale wedding, the global celebration, the genuine hope that their union represented something positive for the monarchy's future. She remembered the overwhelming support from the British people and the sense of purpose she had felt in her new role. Those feelings seemed like echoes from another lifetime now. The reality of royal life had proven far more complex and politically charged than she had anticipated. Every decision, every public appearance, every gesture was analyzed and often criticized. But it wasn't the public pressure that had worn her down. It was the private battles, the feeling that she was fighting alone even within her own family. The letter she was writing was not one of anger or accusation. Instead, it was a carefully worded explanation of her need to step back and reassess her role, both as a member of the royal family and as a mother. She made no direct accusations, but anyone reading between the lines would understand that all was not well within the House of Windsor. Meanwhile, several floors below in the castle's main offices, the daily business of the monarchy continued without any awareness of the momentous decision being made above. Staff members prepared briefing notes, scheduled meetings, and coordinated the complex logistics that kept the royal machine functioning smoothly. Queen Camilla was in her own private office, meeting with her personal assistant about upcoming engagements. She had been particularly energetic lately, taking on more public duties and making subtle but noticeable changes to protocols that had been established during Queen Elizabeth's reign. Some observers had noted her increasing confidence and influence, though few understood the full extent of her ambitions. "I think we should consider expanding my role in the Commonwealth affairs," Camilla was saying, studying a list of upcoming state visits. "There are opportunities there that haven't been fully explored." Her assistant, a sharp woman named Victoria, made careful notes. She had worked for Camilla since before her marriage to Charles and understood her employer's long-term vision better than most. "Shall I reach out to the Commonwealth Secretary General's office?" Victoria asked. "Yes, but do it discreetly. We don't want to appear overeager." Camilla paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Things are finally falling into place as they should. The comment carried implications that Victoria chose not to explore. She had learned over the years that some conversations were better left unfinished, some observations better left unspoken. Back in Catherine's chambers, the princess had completed her letter and sealed it in an envelope marked for the king. She also prepared a separate, more personal note for William, though she knew he wouldn't receive it until evening when he returned from his engagements. "Sarah," she called softly, "please ask the driver to prepare for a journey to Norfolk. We'll be leaving within the hour." "Of course, ma'am. Shall I pack for an extended stay?" Catherine looked around the room that had been her sanctuary for so many years. The photographs of her children, the books she loved, the small personal touches that made the formal space feel like home. Soon, much of this would need to be packed and moved. "Yes," she said finally. "I believe it will be quite extended indeed." As the news of Catherine's sudden departure began to filter through the palace staff, a sense of unease settled over Windsor Castle. Such abrupt changes were unusual in the carefully orchestrated world of royal protocol. Whispered conversations took place in corridors, and meaningful glances were exchanged between long-serving staff members who had witnessed other periods of royal turbulence. The afternoon brought an unexpected visit from King Charles, who had received Catherine's letter and immediately made his way to Windsor. His face was grave as he was escorted to the private family quarters, though Catherine had already departed by then. William returned from his engagements earlier than usual, having been contacted by his father. The two men met in Charles's private study, a room lined with leather-bound books and family portraits spanning generations. "She's gone to Amer Hall," Charles said without preamble, handing William the letter. "She says she needs time to think." William read the carefully worded message twice, his face growing paler with each sentence. The formal language couldn't disguise the pain and disappointment underlying every word. "This is temporary," William said, though his voice lacked conviction. "She's been under stress lately. Some time away will help." Charles studied his son's face, noting the defensive tone and the way William avoided meeting his eyes. As both a father and a king, Charles understood that this situation posed significant challenges on multiple levels. "William," he said gently, "when was the last time you and Catherine had a real conversation about how she's feeling?" The question hung in the air between them. William had been so focused on his royal duties, so determined to prove himself worthy of his future role as king, that he had perhaps lost sight of his most important relationship. "She knows she can talk to me," William replied, but even as he said the words, he wondered if they were true. That evening, as news of Catherine's departure began to leak to the press despite the palace's best efforts at secrecy, Queen Camilla hosted a small dinner party for several prominent members of British society. The guests included politicians, business leaders, and cultural figures, exactly the kind of influential people who could shape public opinion. Throughout the evening, Camilla was the perfect hostess, charming and gracious. But those who knew her well noticed a particular gleam in her eyes, a satisfaction that went beyond the success of a social gathering. "It's such a shame when people can't adapt to their responsibilities," she remarked to a prominent newspaper editor during the cocktail hour. "The monarchy requires a certain level of resilience." The editor, sensing a story, probed gently for more information. But Camilla was too experienced to say anything directly damaging. Instead, she planted subtle seeds of doubt about Catherine's commitment and suitability for royal life. By midnight, the first speculative articles were already being written in newsrooms across London. The phrase, "constitutional crisis," appeared in several early drafts, though editors debated whether such strong language was premature. At Anmer Hall, Catherine sat in the cozy living room of the Georgian mansion, finally, feeling able to breathe freely for the first time in months. The children were asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to engulf their family. For now, Catherine wanted to preserve their innocence for as long as possible. She picked up her phone several times, considering calling William. But, each time, she set it down without dialing. The conversations they needed to have couldn't happen over the phone, and she wasn't ready for them yet anyway. Instead, she walked out onto the terrace and looked up at the star-filled Norfolk sky. Somewhere in London, she knew that plans were already being made, strategies developed, and damage control measures implemented. The royal machine would continue to function as it always did. But, for Catherine, this was the first night in years that she felt like herself again rather than just a carefully managed public figure. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. The silence of the countryside was broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. For the first time in months, Catherine smiled. Not the practiced, public smile she had perfected over the years, but a genuine expression of relief and, perhaps, hope for a different kind of future. As the night deepened, text messages began arriving on the phones of royal correspondents across the country. The story that would dominate headlines for weeks to come was just beginning. But Catherine was finally free to write her own narrative rather than simply playing a role in someone else's. The morning after Catherine's departure brought an unprecedented flurry of activity to Buckingham Palace. The press office phones rang constantly as journalists from around the world sought official comment on the rumors that had begun circulating in the early hours. Sir Michael Hampton, the palace's communications secretary, found himself in the unenviable position of trying to manage a story he didn't fully understand. "The Princess of Wales has temporarily withdrawn from public engagements for personal reasons," became the official line, repeated dozens of times throughout the morning. But experienced royal watchers knew that such vague statements usually concealed more significant developments. Prince William had spent a sleepless night at Windsor Castle, alternating between anger, confusion, and a growing sense of panic. He had tried calling Catherine several times, but she hadn't answered. The formal nature of her letter had shaken him more than he cared to admit. This wasn't the impulsive action of an upset spouse. It was the carefully considered decision of someone who had reached a breaking point. At 10 a.m., William requested an urgent meeting with his father. They met in the king's private study at Clarence House, a room that had witnessed many family crises over the years. Charles looked older than his years, the weight of the situation clearly taking its toll. "Have you spoken to Catherine?" Charles asked as soon as William entered. "She's not taking my calls," William admitted, slumping into one of the leather chairs that had been his grandfather's favorites. "I don't understand how he got to this point." Charles studied his son carefully. As a father, he wanted to comfort William, but, as a monarch, he understood the broader implications of the situation. The stability of the crown depended heavily on the public's perception of the royal family as a united institution. "Perhaps you need to consider what Catherine has been trying to tell you," Charles suggested gently. "Sometimes we become so focused on our duties that we forget our primary obligations to our families." Before William could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. Queen Camilla entered without waiting for permission, a habit that had become more pronounced since her coronation. She was impeccably dressed, as always, but there was something in her demeanor that William found unsettling. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, though her tone suggested she had no intention of leaving regardless of the answer. "I thought you both should know that I've been fielding calls all morning from various members of Parliament and Commonwealth officials. They're concerned about the implications of Catherine's absence." William noticed how she pronounced the word absence, with just enough emphasis to make it sound more significant than a temporary withdrawal. "What have you told them?" Charles asked. Only that family matters sometimes require privacy and understanding, Camilla replied smoothly. Though I did suggest that perhaps this situation might provide an opportunity to reassess certain aspects of our public engagement strategy. The comment hung in the air like smoke from a barely contained fire. William felt his anger rising but struggled to articulate exactly why Camilla's words bothered him so much. Catherine will be back, he said firmly. This is just a temporary misunderstanding. Camilla's smile was sympathetic but somehow managed to convey doubt. Of course, darling. Though we should probably prepare for various contingencies. The monarchy has weathered many storms by being adaptable. After she left, Charles and William sat in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Charles spoke what they were both thinking. You need to go to Norfolk, he said. Today, whatever issues exist between you and Catherine need to be resolved privately before this becomes a public crisis. Meanwhile, at Amer Hall, Catherine was experiencing her first peaceful morning in months. She had woken early and taken a long walk through the estate grounds, breathing in the crisp Norfolk air and feeling the tension gradually leaving her shoulders. The children had joined her for breakfast, their cheerful chatter a welcome contrast to the formal meals that had become the norm at their official residences. Prince George, now approaching his teenage years, had always been perceptive about adult emotions. During breakfast, he studied his mother's face with unusual intensity. Mom, he said carefully, is everything all right? You seem different. Catherine reached across the table and took his hand. I'm fine, sweetheart. Sometimes adults need time to think about important things, just like you do when you have a difficult decision to make. Princess Charlotte, ever direct, cut straight to the heart of the matter. Are you and Papa having an argument? The question was so innocent yet so accurate that Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Papa and I love each other very much, she said, which was true even if it no longer felt sufficient. But sometimes people who love each other need time apart to figure out how to be better together. Prince Louis, the youngest, seemed satisfied with this explanation and returned to his pancakes. But Catherine could see that her older children understood more than they were saying. After breakfast, Catherine retreated to the small study that had always been her favorite room at Amer Hall. Unlike her formal office at Kensington Palace, this space was entirely her own, filled with books she had chosen, photographs that made her smile, and comfortable furniture that invited relaxation rather than maintaining proper posture. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, staff members, and officials, but she had decided to maintain radio silence until she was ready to engage. The only exception was a text from her sister Pippa, who had somehow sensed that something significant was happening. Whatever you're going through, you're not alone, the message read. Call me when you're ready. The simple offer of unconditional support brought tears to Catherine's eyes. It reminded her of what had been missing from her marriage lately. The feeling that someone was truly on her side, not because of duty or protocol, but because they cared about her well-being. Around noon, Catherine heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching. She looked out the window to see a royal aircraft landing on the estate's helicopter pad. Her heart began racing as she recognized William's figure emerging from the aircraft. She watched from the window as he walked toward the house, his shoulders set in a way she recognized from their early disagreements. He was preparing for a confrontation, approaching this as a problem to be solved rather than a relationship to be healed. When the housekeeper announced his arrival, Catherine asked for a few minutes before joining him in the main drawing room. She needed to center herself, to remember why she had made this difficult decision. William was standing by the fireplace when she entered, his face a mixture of relief and frustration. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, years of shared history and recent disappointments creating a complex emotional landscape between them. Catherine, he said finally, his voice gentler than she had expected. I've been worried sick. Your letter. I don't understand what's happening. She took a seat across from him, maintaining some physical distance while they talked. That's exactly the problem, William. You don't understand, and, lately, you haven't seemed interested in trying to understand. That's not fair, he protested. I've been dealing with enormous pressures. The transition since father became king, the increased responsibilities, the constant scrutiny. I thought you understood that. I do understand those pressures, Catherine replied calmly. I live with them too. But, somewhere along the way, we stopped being partners facing those challenges together. Instead, it feels like I've become another obligation you need to manage. William sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that reminded Catherine of the young man She had fallen in love with at university. "I never meant for you to feel that way," he said quietly. "These past months have been overwhelming. I thought I was protecting you by handling things myself." "Protecting me from what?" "From having input into decisions that affect our family? From being treated as an equal partner in our marriage." Catherine's voice remained steady, but William could hear the pain beneath the controlled surface. They talked for nearly 2 hours, finally, beginning to address issues that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. William learned about small slights and excluded conversations that had accumulated into a larger pattern of marginalization. Catherine explained how Camilla's increasing influence had created an atmosphere where she felt constantly undermined. "She's not malicious," Catherine said carefully, "but she has her own vision for how things should be, and that vision doesn't seem to include me having a significant role." "Camilla is trying to help," William insisted, but his tone lacked the conviction it had carried in previous conversations. "Is she? Or is she positioning herself as the primary female figure in the royal family now that your grandmother is gone?" The question forced William to consider patterns he had been reluctant to acknowledge. Camilla's suggestions about Catherine focusing more on private family life, the subtle way she had inserted herself into decisions that traditionally would have involved the Princess of Wales, the manner in which she had begun speaking about the future direction of the monarchy. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the children, who burst into the room with the unself-conscious energy of young people who had missed one of their parents. William's face softened immediately as he embraced them, and Catherine felt a pang of sadness watching the easy affection between father and children. "Are you staying for dinner, Papa?" Charlotte asked hopefully. William looked at Catherine, who nodded slightly. "Yes, I think I'll stay tonight," he said, though both adults knew that one evening wouldn't resolve the fundamental issues they were facing. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, William and Catherine continued their conversation on the terrace overlooking the estate's gardens. The setting was peaceful, reminiscent of happier times when they had used this space to plan their future together. "What do you need from me?" William asked finally, the question Catherine had been waiting months to hear. "I need you to see me as your partner, not just as the mother of your children or a representative of the crown," she replied. "I need you to consider my perspective before making decisions that affect our family. And I need you to understand that your stepmother's increasing influence is creating an impossible situation for me." William was quiet for a long time, processing what Catherine had said. He began to see recent events through her eyes. Meetings where her input had been dismissed, public appearances where she had been subtly sidelined, conversations where Camilla had spoken for the family without consulting Catherine. "I didn't realize," he said finally. "I was so focused on proving myself to father and the rest of the establishment that I lost sight of what was happening to us." "I know you didn't realize," Catherine replied gently. "That's what made it so painful. It felt like you were choosing everyone else's needs over mine, and you didn't even know you were doing it." Meanwhile, back in London, Queen Camilla was hosting another carefully orchestrated social gathering, this time a casual lunch for several prominent figures in British media. The conversation naturally turned to the royal family's recent challenges. "It's so important for the monarchy to present a united front," she remarked to the editor of a major newspaper. "Personal difficulties, while understandable, can't be allowed to overshadow the institution's broader mission." Her comments were carefully calibrated, expressing appropriate concern while subtly reinforcing the narrative that Catherine's withdrawal represented a failure to meet royal expectations. Several guests noticed the particular satisfaction in Camilla's expression when the conversation turned to speculation about the future structure of royal duties. "Perhaps some roles need to be redistributed," she suggested delicately. "Fresh perspectives can be quite valuable." By evening, several influential commentators had received background briefings that painted Catherine's departure as evidence of her unsuitability for the pressures of modern royal life. The spin was subtle but effective, gradually shifting public perception in ways that would be difficult to reverse. Back at Amer Hall, William made a decision that surprised both himself and Catherine. Instead of returning to London as planned, he called his private secretary and cleared his schedule for the rest of the week. "I'm staying here," he told Catherine. "We need time to work through this properly, and the children deserve to have both parents present for a while." For the first time in months, Catherine felt a glimmer of hope that their marriage might be salvageable. But both of them knew that the real challenges lay ahead, not just in rebuilding their relationship, but in confronting the political forces that had contributed to its deterioration. As they prepared for bed in their separate rooms, a symbolic distance that reflected their current emotional state, neither could have imagined how dramatically events would unfold in the coming days. The forces that had been set in motion by Catherine's departure were gathering momentum, and the true test of their marriage, and the monarchy itself, was still to come. The third day of Catherine's absence from official duties brought an unexpected development that would forever change the trajectory of the royal crisis. A junior member of Camilla's household staff, 26-year-old Emma Richardson, arrived at her job at Clarence House with a heavy conscience and a digital recording device hidden in her handbag. Emma had worked as an administrative assistant in the Queen's private office for 18 months. She had always taken pride in her discretion and professionalism, but recent conversations she had overheard had deeply disturbed her. The daughter of a single mother who had struggled to make ends meet, Emma had always admired Catherine's charitable work with disadvantaged families and children. What she had witnessed over the past few weeks had shaken her faith in the institution she served. That morning, as Queen Camilla prepared for what she believed would be another successful day of subtle manipulation and strategic positioning, she had no idea that her carefully constructed plans were about to unravel in spectacular fashion. The day began routinely enough. Camilla met with her communications team to review the morning's press coverage, which had largely followed the narrative she had been carefully cultivating. Headlines focused on Catherine's inability to cope with royal pressures and speculation about her commitment to duty. "The public is beginning to see the situation our way," her press secretary, James Morrison, reported with satisfaction. "The narrative is shifting from sympathy for the princess to questions about her dedication to the crown." Camilla's smile was subtle but unmistakably pleased. "Good. We must ensure that any future developments are understood in the proper context." What followed was a conversation that Emma Richardson would later describe as the most shocking 30 minutes of her life. Speaking with complete confidence that they were among trusted allies, Camilla and her inner circle discussed their long-term strategy for marginalizing Catherine and eventually maneuvering her out of prominent royal roles. "The beauty of this situation," Camilla explained to her assembled staff, "is that Catherine has done the work for us. Her departure can be framed as evidence that she was never truly suited for this life. When she returns, if she returns, her position will be permanently weakened." Victoria, Camilla's longtime personal assistant, nodded approvingly. "The Commonwealth tour next year would be an excellent opportunity to showcase your expanded role, ma'am. If Catherine is perceived as unreliable, those responsibilities could naturally shift to you." Emma, who had been filing documents nearby, felt her hands begin to tremble as she realized the full scope of what she was hearing. These weren't casual observations about a difficult situation. This was a coordinated campaign to destroy Catherine's reputation and role within the royal family. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Camilla outlining specific strategies for undermining Catherine's public image while positioning herself as the stable, reliable figure the monarchy needed. She discussed leveraging her relationships with media figures, political leaders, and influential members of society to create an environment where Catherine's return would be seen as a liability rather than an asset. "The key is patience," Camilla explained. "We allow this crisis to unfold naturally while ensuring that the resolution favors our long-term objectives. By the time Catherine realizes what has happened, it will be too late to reverse course." Emma excused herself from the room, claiming she needed to retrieve additional files from the archive. Instead, she went to the nearest ladies' room, locked herself in a stall, and tried to process what she had just heard. Her loyalty to the crown was genuine, but what she had witnessed felt like a betrayal of everything the monarchy was supposed to represent. After struggling with her conscience for several hours, Emma made a decision that would change everything. Using her security clearance and intimate knowledge of the palace's communication systems, she began documenting evidence of Camilla's campaign against Catherine. Meanwhile, at Amer Hall, William and Catherine were experiencing their first genuine conversation in months. Away from the formal constraints of official residences and the constant pressure of royal protocol, they began to rediscover the connection that had sustained them through their courtship and early married years. "I keep thinking about our wedding day," Catherine said as they walked through the estate's apple orchard with the children. "Do you remember what you said during your speech at the reception?" William smiled at the memory. "I promised that we would face everything together, as equals and partners. When did we stop doing that?" Catherine asked gently. The question prompted a long discussion that evening about the subtle ways their relationship had changed as William's responsibilities increased. They talked about missed signals, unspoken assumptions, and the gradual erosion of the mutual respect that had once defined their partnership. I think I became so focused on proving I was ready to be king someday that I forgot how to be a husband, William admitted. I let other people's expectations and advice override my own judgment about what was best for our family. Catherine appreciated his honesty, but she could see that he still didn't fully understand the extent to which Camilla had orchestrated many of the situations that had driven them apart. It wasn't just neglect, William, she said carefully. There were deliberate efforts to undermine my position and influence. I tried to tell you, but you always had explanations that made my concerns seem petty or paranoid. Before William could respond, his phone rang with a call from his private secretary. The conversation was brief but intense, and Catherine could see from his expression that something significant had happened. There's been a development, William said after ending the call. Someone has contacted the press with allegations about Camilla's involvement in our situation. Father wants to see both of us immediately. The flight back to London was tense, with both William and Catherine wondering what new crisis awaited them. They had agreed to present a united front publicly while continuing to work through their private issues, but the prospect of external revelations about their family troubles was deeply unsettling. At Buckingham Palace, they found King Charles in his private study with several senior advisors, including the private secretary to the king and the communications secretary. The atmosphere was grim, and Charles looked as though he had aged years in the past few days. We've received what appears to be credible information about conversations that took place in Camilla's office, Charles began without preamble. The details are troubling. He handed William a folder containing transcripts of the recorded conversations, along with supporting documentation that Emma Richardson had carefully compiled. As William read, his face grew progressively paler, and Catherine could see his hands beginning to shake. The transcripts revealed not only Camilla's strategy for marginalizing Catherine, but also her broader ambitions for reshaping the monarchy around her own vision and influence. There were references to private conversations with media figures, political leaders, and even foreign dignitaries, all designed to gradually position Camilla as the primary female voice of the royal family. My God, William whispered as he finished reading. She's been planning this for months, maybe years. Catherine felt a complex mix of vindication and sadness as she read the evidence that confirmed her worst suspicions. Part of her was relieved to finally have proof that her concerns had been valid, but she also felt deeply hurt that it had taken documented evidence for William to believe her. The question now, Charles said heavily, is how we handle this situation. The source has indicated that this information will become public within 24 hours unless we take immediate action. The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. If the recordings became public, the resulting scandal would dwarf any previous royal crisis. The revelation that the Queen had been actively working to undermine the Princess of Wales would shock the public and potentially irreparably damage the monarchy's reputation. We need to get ahead of this, the communications secretary said finally. If we can control the narrative and demonstrate that appropriate action has been taken, we might be able to minimize the damage. What kind of action? William asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Charles looked at his son with infinite sadness. Camilla will have to step back from her public duties, at least temporarily. The extent of that withdrawal will depend on how we choose to handle this crisis. The conversation continued for another hour, with various strategies being discussed and evaluated. Throughout the discussion, Catherine remained largely silent, processing the vindication of concerns that had been dismissed for so long. Finally, Charles asked to speak with William and Catherine privately. After the advisors left, he turned to his daughter-in-law with an expression of deep regret. Catherine, I owe you an apology, he said simply. I should have listened more carefully to your concerns. I allowed my loyalty to Camilla to blind me to what was happening to you and William. Catherine appreciated the apology, but she could see the painful position Charles was now in. Camilla wasn't just his wife. She was his queen, and any action taken against her would have profound personal and constitutional implications. What matters now is how we move forward, Catherine replied diplomatically. This family has endured scandals before. We can get through this one too, but only if we commit to complete honesty and transparency with each other going forward. William, who had been unusually quiet throughout the discussion, finally spoke up. I want to know everything, he said firmly. Every conversation, every decision, every strategy session. If we're going to rebuild trust, it has to start with absolute truth. The commitment to transparency would prove more challenging than any of them anticipated. Over the following hours, as more evidence emerged and the full scope of Camilla's activities became clear, the royal family would face the most serious internal crisis in generations. But, for Catherine, the most important development was seeing William finally understand the reality she had been living with for months. The path ahead would be difficult, but, for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wouldn't be walking it alone. As evening approached, and the family prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most challenging period in recent royal history, none of them could have anticipated the public reaction that was about to unfold. The British people, who had watched Catherine grow from a university student into a beloved princess, would not take kindly to the revelation that she had been systematically undermined by someone they had been taught to respect as their queen. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the survival of the monarchy, but also the fundamental values it claimed to represent. In the eye of this approaching storm, William and Catherine found themselves united once again, not just as husband and wife, but as partners determined to protect their family and the institution they had sworn to serve. The recordings that Emma Richardson had risked her career to preserve would change everything. By morning, the entire world would know what had been happening behind the closed doors of the British royal family, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun had barely risen over London when the story broke with the force of a seismic shock. The headlines that appeared on newspaper websites and social media platforms were unprecedented in their directness. Palace conspiracy. Secret recordings reveal Queen's campaign against Princess Catherine. The accompanying article, published simultaneously by 3 major news outlets, contained enough verified detail to eliminate any possibility of dismissal as tabloid speculation. Emma Richardson had made her choice during the dark hours before dawn, working with investigative journalists to ensure that the story would be unassailable when it emerged. The evidence she provided was comprehensive. Not only the audio recordings from Camilla's office, but also internal emails, meeting notes, and a detailed timeline showing how the campaign against Catherine had evolved over months. At Buckingham Palace, the morning briefing that should have covered routine administrative matters instead became an emergency crisis management session. Sir Michael Hampton, the communications secretary, had been fielding calls from media outlets around the world since 5 a.m., and the palace's standard responses felt woefully inadequate for the magnitude of what was unfolding. "We need a statement from their majesties immediately," Sir Michael told the assembled staff. "Every minute we remain silent gives the story more momentum." But crafting a response proved nearly impossible. How could the palace acknowledge the truth of the recordings without admitting that the Queen had engaged in a deliberate campaign against the Princess of Wales? How could they deny allegations that were supported by such compelling evidence? King Charles had spent the night in his private study, alternating between reading the transcripts and staring out at the palace gardens where he had played as a child. The weight of the situation was crushing. This wasn't just a political crisis, but a deeply personal betrayal that threatened everything he had worked to build since becoming king. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, had retreated to her private chambers and refused to see anyone except her personal lawyer. The confident, calculating woman who had orchestrated months of subtle manipulation now found herself facing the complete collapse of her carefully constructed plans. Her first instinct had been to deny everything, but the audio quality was too clear and her voice too recognizable. Her second thought had been to claim that her comments had been taken out of context, but the recordings were extensive enough to eliminate any ambiguity about her intentions. By 9 a.m., her lawyer had delivered a harsh assessment. There was no viable strategy for disputing the evidence. The only question was how to minimize the long-term damage to her position and reputation. Prince William received the news while still at Anmer Hall, where he had been having breakfast with Catherine and the children. His phone had been buzzing incessantly since dawn, but he had ignored it until his private secretary called with increasing urgency. "Sir, you need to see the morning news," was all his secretary said, but the tone conveyed the gravity of the situation. William and Catherine gathered around a laptop in the study, watching in stunned silence as news anchors discussed the recordings with an air of barely contained excitement. Royal correspondents who had spent decades covering the family with careful deference now spoke openly about the unprecedented crisis and the shocking betrayal revealed by the evidence. "I can't believe it's actually happening," Catherine whispered, watching footage of crowds gathering outside Buckingham Palace. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Many people carried signs supporting Catherine and demanding accountability from Camilla. The children, sensing the adult tension even if they didn't understand its source, stayed close to their parents throughout the morning. Prince George, old enough to grasp that something significant was occurring, asked direct questions that his parents struggled to answer. Why are people so angry? He wanted to know, having overheard news reports discussing the crisis. William knelt to his son's eye level, searching for age-appropriate words to explain an incredibly complex situation. Sometimes adults make mistakes that hurt other people, he said finally. When that happens, there are consequences, and sometimes those consequences are very public. By mid-morning, William and Catherine knew they had to return to London. The palace had requested their immediate presence for an emergency family meeting, and their continued absence was beginning to generate additional speculation about the state of their marriage. The helicopter flight back to London provided a sobering view of the crisis's impact. News vans lined the approach roads to all the royal residences, and crowds of people had gathered at key locations throughout the capital. Some carried signs supporting Catherine, while others demanded answers about what the royal correspondent on the radio called the systematic campaign of psychological warfare against the Princess of Wales. At Buckingham Palace, they were escorted immediately to the king's private study, where they found Charles looking older and more fragile than they had ever seen him. The weight of choosing between his wife and the survival of the monarchy was etched into every line of his face. The polling data is catastrophic, he said without preamble, referring to the emergency public opinion research that had been conducted throughout the morning. 73% of respondents believe Camilla should abdicate her role as queen. 68% have decreased confidence in the monarchy as an institution. The numbers represented more than political damage. They threatened the fundamental legitimacy that allowed the constitutional monarchy to function. If public support continued to erode, the crisis could evolve from a personal scandal into an existential threat to the crown itself. What are our options? William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Very limited, Charles replied heavily. Camilla has offered to issue a public apology and temporarily withdraw from official duties. But I'm not sure that will be sufficient given the nature of what she's revealed to have done. Catherine, who had remained silent during the initial discussion, finally spoke up. With respect, Your Majesty, a temporary withdrawal isn't an acknowledgement of the seriousness of what happened. The recordings show months of deliberate actions designed to undermine my role and damage my reputation. The public deserves a response that matches the gravity of the offense. Charles looked at his daughter-in-law with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Even in the midst of personal vindication, Catherine was thinking about the broader implications for the institution they all served. You're right, he said quietly. But you're asking me to choose between my wife and my throne. No, Catherine replied gently. I'm asking you to choose between protecting someone who betrayed your family and protecting the monarchy that your mother spent 70 years building. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Michael Hampton, whose face was grim with new developments. Your Majesty, I'm afraid the situation has escalated significantly. The Prime Minister has requested an urgent meeting, and we've received word that several Commonwealth leaders are expressing concern about the crisis. The international implications were beginning to crystallize. The British monarchy wasn't just a domestic institution. It served as the constitutional head for multiple nations, and instability in the royal family could have far-reaching political consequences. There's something else, Sir Michael continued reluctantly. We've received information suggesting that this morning's revelations may only be the beginning. The source apparently has additional recordings from earlier meetings. The prospect of more damaging revelations emerging in the coming days added another layer of urgency to an already impossible situation. Charles realized that decisive action couldn't be delayed much longer. Meanwhile, across London, Queen Camilla was meeting with her legal team and closest advisors in the heavily secured environment of Clarence House. The fortress-like atmosphere felt appropriate for someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. The public relations battle is lost, her advisor Victoria said bluntly. The recordings are too clear, too extensive, and too damaging. Any strategy focused on denial or minimization will only make things worse. Camilla's lawyer, a distinguished man named Sir Geoffrey Morrison who had represented members of the royal family through previous crises, was equally direct in his assessment. Ma'am, you have two choices, he said carefully. You can fight this and likely face even more damaging revelations as the investigation continues. Or you can accept responsibility and try to salvage what's possible from this situation. Salvage what exactly? Camilla asked bitterly. My reputation is destroyed. My position is untenable. What exactly is left to salvage? Your marriage to the king, for one thing, Sir Geoffrey replied. And possibly some measure of eventual rehabilitation if you handle this correctly. But even as they discussed damage control strategies, more evidence was emerging. Emma Richardson, working with journalists and law enforcement officials, had provided access to Camilla's digital communications that revealed the true scope of her activities. The additional evidence showed not only the campaign against Catherine, but also efforts to influence media coverage, manipulate public perceptions, and coordinate with outside allies to weaken Catherine's position. Most damaging of all were communications suggesting that Camilla had been planning these activities since before Charles became king, viewing the transition as an opportunity to reshape the monarchy according to her own vision. By afternoon, the story had evolved beyond a simple revelation of palace intrigue. Legal experts were discussing potential charges related to conspiracy and abuse of position. Constitutional scholars were debating whether Camilla's actions constituted a breach of her oath as queen consort. Political commentators were questioning whether the monarchy could survive such a fundamental betrayal of trust. The human cost was equally devastating. Charles had spent the day in emergency meetings with government officials, palace administrators, and family members, trying to navigate a crisis that seemed to worsen with each passing hour. The man who had waited decades to become king now faced the possibility that his reign might be defined by this single catastrophic failure of judgment about the woman he loved. For William and Catherine, the day brought a strange mix of vindication and sorrow. Catherine's concerns had been thoroughly validated, but the price of that validation was the destruction of family relationships and institutional stability that would take years to rebuild. As evening approached, the palace prepared for what would be one of the most difficult announcements in royal history. The statement that emerged would need to balance accountability with institutional survival, personal relationships with public duty, and immediate crisis management with long-term constitutional stability. Outside the palace gates, crowds continued to grow as people demanded answers and accountability. The British public, who had been shocked by the morning's revelations, now waited to see whether their monarchy would rise to meet this unprecedented challenge or crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. The most difficult decisions still lay ahead, but one thing had become clear. The royal family that emerged from this crisis would be fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. The comfortable certainties that had governed palace life for generations had been shattered, replaced by an urgent need for transparency, accountability, and genuine reform. The morning's revelations had changed everything, but the evening's decisions would determine whether anything could be salvaged from the wreckage of trust and tradition that lay scattered across the corridors of power. The palace corridors that had witnessed centuries of royal drama had never seen anything quite like the scene that unfolded on the evening of what would become known as Revelation Day. As news of the additional evidence continued to break, senior members of the royal household moved through Buckingham Palace with the urgent purposefulness of people managing an unprecedented constitutional crisis. King Charles had called for a private family meeting in the Blue Drawing Room, a space traditionally reserved for the most solemn occasions. The choice of location sent a clear signal to all involved. This was not a family dispute, but a formal proceeding that would determine the future of the monarchy itself. Queen Camilla arrived first, accompanied by her legal counsel, and looking more composed than anyone had expected. She had spent the afternoon coming to terms with the inevitable, and her demeanor suggested someone who had finally accepted the magnitude of her situation. The confident, calculating woman who had orchestrated months of manipulation was gone, replaced by someone who seemed almost relieved that the pretense was finally over. Prince William and Catherine entered together, presenting the united front they had promised to maintain despite their ongoing personal issues. The events of the past few days had reminded them why they had fallen in love and married in the first place, their shared commitment to something larger than themselves, and their ability to support each other through impossible circumstances. The tension in the room was palpable as Charles began what would become one of the most difficult conversations in modern royal history. The king, who had spent his entire life preparing for this role, now faced a decision that could define not only his reign but the future of the institution itself. "We all know why we're here," Charles began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had aged years in a single day. The evidence that has emerged today represents a fundamental breach of trust that cannot be ignored or minimized. Camilla listened without interruption as Charles outlined the scope of her actions as revealed by the recordings and documents. The campaign against Catherine, the media manipulation, the attempts to reshape the monarchy according to her own vision, all of it was laid out with devastating clarity. The question before us, Charles continued, is how we respond in a way that acknowledges the severity of what has occurred while preserving the institution we all serve. For the first time since arriving, Camilla spoke. Her voice was steady but carried none of the confident authority that had characterized her interactions in recent months. I accept full responsibility for my actions, she said simply. I allowed my personal ambitions and my desire to protect what I saw as the monarchy's interests to cloud my judgment. I betrayed Catherine's trust, William's confidence, and your faith in me. Most importantly, I betrayed the institution I swore to serve. The admission, while expected, still landed with significant impact. Catherine felt a complex mix of emotions, satisfaction at finally hearing acknowledgement of the treatment she had endured, sadness at the destruction of family relationships, and concern about the broader implications for the monarchy. The question now, Charles said, is what action we take to address this betrayal and begin the process of rebuilding public trust. What followed was a discussion that would have profound implications not only for the immediate participants, but for the future of constitutional monarchy in Britain. Various options were considered, ranging from a public apology and temporary withdrawal from duties to more drastic measures that would fundamentally alter Camilla's role within the royal family. A simple apology won't be sufficient, William said firmly. The public has seen evidence of months of deliberate deception. They deserve a response that matches the seriousness of what has been revealed. Catherine, who had been largely silent during the initial discussion, finally offered her perspective. What matters most is that we emerge from this crisis stronger and more unified than when we entered it, she said. Whatever decisions we make need to serve that goal, not just manage this immediate situation. Outside the palace, the crowds that had been gathering throughout the day had grown to unprecedented size. Thousands of people had come to express their support for Catherine and their anger at the revelations about Camilla. The demonstration was peaceful but unmistakably forceful in its message. The British people would not tolerate such betrayal from their royal family. The evening news broadcasts carried images of the crowds alongside expert commentary about the constitutional implications of the crisis. Legal scholars debated whether Camilla's actions constituted grounds for formal removal from her position, while political commentators discussed the potential impact on upcoming elections and Britain's international relationships. Inside the palace, the family meeting continued past midnight as various scenarios were analyzed and debated. The complexity of the situation went far beyond personal relationships. Any action taken against Camilla would have legal, constitutional, and diplomatic ramifications that would be felt for years to come. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to appear over London, a decision was reached. King Charles, looking exhausted but resolute, outlined the course of action that had been agreed upon by all parties. Effective immediately, Queen Camilla will withdraw from all official duties and public appearances, he announced. She will issue a full public apology acknowledging her actions and accepting responsibility for the damage they have caused. Additionally, she will undergo a formal review process to determine her future role within the royal family. The decision represented something unprecedented in modern royal history, a reigning queen consort being stripped of her official functions due to her own misconduct. The implications would ripple through every aspect of royal protocol and constitutional law. Camilla accepted the decision with a dignity that surprised even her harshest critics. I understand and accept these consequences, she said quietly. I can only hope that someday, through my actions rather than my words, I might earn back some measure of the trust one have so thoroughly destroyed. The formal announcement was released to the press at 6 a.m., accompanied by a personal statement from Camilla that was unprecedented in its scope and specificity. Unlike the carefully worded non-apologies that had characterized previous royal scandals, this statement included explicit acknowledgement of specific actions and their impact. I engaged in a deliberate campaign to undermine the Princess of Wales, the statement read in part. I used my position and influence to damage her reputation and limit her role within the royal family. These actions were inexcusable, and I accept full responsibility for the pain and damage they have caused. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Polling data released throughout the morning showed dramatic shifts in public opinion. Support for Catherine reached unprecedented levels, while Camilla's approval ratings collapsed to single digits. More importantly for the long-term health of the monarchy, confidence in King Charles began to recover as the public recognized his willingness to take decisive action against someone he loved for the good of the institution. The international reaction was equally significant. Commonwealth leaders, who had been expressing private concerns about the crisis, issued statements supporting Charles's decision and reaffirming their confidence in the monarchy. The swift and decisive response had prevented the crisis from escalating into a broader constitutional emergency. For Catherine, the resolution brought a complex mix of emotions. The vindication she had long sought came at an enormous personal and institutional cost. The woman who had become her nemesis was now publicly disgraced, but Catherine took no pleasure in the destruction of another person's life and reputation. "I want to be very clear about something," Catherine said in her first public statement since returning to royal duties. "While I am grateful that the truth has been revealed, I take no satisfaction in the personal cost it has exacted. My hope is that we can all learn from this experience and emerge as a stronger, more transparent institution that truly serves the British people." William, meanwhile, found himself dealing with the complex aftermath of seeing his father forced to choose between his wife and his crown. The decision Charles had made was correct and necessary, but it had come at an enormous personal cost that would affect family relationships for years to come. "My father made an impossible choice with courage and integrity," William said in his own statement. "He put the needs of the nation and the monarchy above his personal relationships, which is exactly what we would expect from our king. I am proud of his leadership during this crisis, and Catherine and I are committed to supporting him as we rebuild trust with the British people." The weeks that followed brought a series of reforms designed to prevent similar crises in the future. New protocols were established for internal communications, oversight mechanisms were strengthened, and greater transparency was introduced in royal decision-making processes. Emma Richardson, the young staff member whose courage had exposed the conspiracy, was quietly relocated to a position with significantly enhanced security protections. Her willingness to risk her career for the sake of truth had changed the course of royal history, and measures were taken to ensure her safety in the aftermath of such a high-profile revelation. 3 months after the crisis, Catherine stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace during the Trooping the Colours ceremony, waving to crowds that cheered her with unprecedented enthusiasm. The British people had clearly made their choice about who they wanted to represent them, and Catherine had emerged from the crisis stronger and more popular than ever. The monarchy had survived its greatest test in generations, but it had been fundamentally changed in the process. The comfortable certainties of previous eras had been replaced by new expectations of accountability and transparency. The institution that emerged was more democratic in its spirit, more responsive to public concerns, and more committed to the values it claimed to represent. Camilla, meanwhile, had retreated to a private life of reflection and attempted redemption. The woman who had once seemed poised to become one of the most influential queens in British history now faced the challenge of rebuilding her life and relationships from the foundation up. The royal family that gathered for their first public appearance after the crisis looked different than the one that had seemed so confident just months before. But they also looked more authentic, more united in their commitment to service, and more aware of the precious nature of the trust they held from the British people. As Catherine looked out at the celebrating crowds, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain and isolation she had endured had been terrible, but they had also revealed strengths she hadn't known she possessed and clarified values that would guide her for the rest of her life. The monarchy would continue, as it had for over 1,000 years. But it would do so with a renewed understanding that power without accountability is a privilege easily lost, and that trust, once broken, can only be rebuilt through consistent demonstration of the values that justify its existence in the first place. In the end, the crisis that had threatened to destroy the royal family had instead transformed it into something stronger, more honest, and more worthy of the loyalty it sought from the people it served. The truth had been painful, but it had also been liberating, for Catherine, for the monarchy, and for a nation that had rediscovered its voice in demanding better from those who claimed to represent its highest ideals.